Hey, Chris, thank you for coming in. You just have such an amazing background with Atypical Ventures and just a history of innovation and investments and just, as an operator, investor, and leading innovation, and just really interesting what you're doing now. So I really appreciate you coming in, sharing your insights with my audience.
Thank you for having me, Stephen. Appreciate it. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, looking forward to it. In fact, I just did one with Bob Langer just before this one, so that was fascinating. Um, so Chris, I mean, you've got this amazing background. You're doing remarkable global contributions. You're really shaping the future of the world with everything you do. What were the three kind of milestones, the inflection points in your life that made this wonderful person you are today? It could have been when you're 3 or 5 years old. It could be something inside out to the family, an early career move, a discovery, a challenge. It could have been something that happened in school. So, what are those magic moments that made you this wonderful, amazing person?
Uh, a great question. So if I were to think back, the first couple things that came to mind, one, I guess a little known fact, I'm adoptive, and I've always known that I was adoptive. My parents were always very forthright, throughout my entire upbringing, that was the case, and uh, maybe being a little too much like laying down on the couch and talking to you, that somehow put a chip on my shoulder, in a way, and so far as I always wanted to kind of uh outdo myself, and I always wanted to kind of strive for something, I guess, a bit more, as a way to, I don't know, impress upon my parents, the things that I was doing or something like that. I think that has kind of stuck with me throughout, and definitely is the thing that really drives me, day to day in many ways. I think then if I were to flash forward, there are a couple more career oriented inflection points that have then kind of put me on the path to where I am today. One of those was in college in an engineering entrepreneurship course. I had a professor who, in no explicit terms, said if you ever want to start a company, you need to learn sales, period.
That's true.
Because everything that you will do as the CEO of a company is sales. Whether you're talking to customers, you're talking to investors, you're talking to people that you want to bring on board to the team, you name it, you're selling all day, every day. And I took that to heart. And so when I left university, I immediately went into a sales role and learned what it meant to pick up the phone and dial for dollars. And that was very transformative. And I think kind of instilled in me the notion that, one, it takes that forward momentum and the action to kind of drive your attitude. So you can wake up in the morning and maybe you have a bad day, but if you kind of continue to do the action that you're supposed to be doing, you'll actually start to have a good day. And you can kind of influence your own attitudes and behaviors that way. And of course, it gave me kind of the skills that are necessary to, start and build and scale a company. And then I'd say the third would be, when I joined as first employee and then ran operations for Spire, the small satellite company. So that gave me, I guess, a really keen understanding of what it means to move incredibly fast, and to work at kind of that rapid clip that's required for truly successful company building. So we went from zero to space in 12 months with 3 satellites, and we launched about 65 over the following couple of years. And we were working in a global from day one business, highly regulated. You talk about product launches, and in this case, you literally have to strap your product to a rocket, and you will never see it again, and it could explode on the tarmac. You don't know. But I think that that gave me just this kind of extreme trial by fire, notion of building a company. And so collectively, as I think back and listen to your question, like those three things immediately call out to me as just like being very transformative in their own unique ways.
So, you have this early adoptive experience, and your parents are very transparent to you, but you also had this drive to kind of stand out or kind of driving yourself to be first in some ways. But what generated at that time you're interested in tech and things like that, or was that a later kind of discovery?
No, that was an early one. I've always been a builder. So as a kid, well, as a kid, my parents would say that I was always a taker-aparter. So I've always wanted to dismantle the things we had in the house, and whether or not I could actually put them back together the way that they should be, was open to debate. Um, but I was, taking apart VCRs and camcorders and all sorts of things as a kid. And then I think the flip side to that is I was always building. So I was a huge Lego nut. In fact, I literally have a coffee cup in front of me that's a Lego face today. So I still love playing with Legos with my kids. And I think that that always put me in this mindset of, you take a random hodgepodge of pieces and you try to create something that has not existed before. And I think those two things kind of married together always put me on this path towards like, what is the frontier? What is next possible, given the building blocks we have in front of us? It sounds
Yeah,
more
I mean,
profound than it is, but I feel like I stumbled into it somehow.
yeah, I mean, a builder and a curiosity, and you're taking things apart and trying to put them back together again, and then Lego is very creative, and you can sort of have it imagine something, and you can try creating it, and then you also indicated that you had this early kind of mentor saying, you know what, you could go into engineering, but you got to be able to sell as well, and I taught for many years, and I used to teach computing students, and that was kind of like a difficult area because I also taught business. So I taught the marketing course. So, and the marketing students who were in the marketing course, they didn't like the tech, and the tech people didn't like the marketing. It was kind of fun to bring them together. So, but I really understand that motivation. So and it really makes you then the ability to communicate well with others, and then this working with this Spire Global and I mean regulatory and risk and governance and all of these things that you have to manage, plus innovation.
Yeah.
A great crucible, and you were the first employee too and head of operations, so I mean you were in the middle of everything, right?
Yep.
And usually when you're the first employee, you do everything. Right. So you have to
That
be
is
sort
true.
of the Swiss Army knife of everything, right? So that's
Yep.
an amazing journey. And then what happened after you left Spire?
So after that, I basically decided at the time that I left that I really enjoyed the frenetic 0 to 1 phase of company building. And it's kind of like managed chaos. I mean, the reality is every company has a bit of managed chaos, but I just think it's a different level of it, maybe at the earliest stages. And so I left Spire. I spent a bit of time on kind of the pure software side. So I stood up operations at a company called Clearbit and kind of the BI developer tooling side. And then I did the same thing at a company called Vercel. And, I kind of moonlighted, I guess, as an advisor to a number of other frontier tech companies. So I was working with AI semiconductor company. I was working with a company doing geospatial intelligence, working with a company in kind of the autonomous vehicle space, and doing a lot of things to kind of, I guess, chase my curiosity in a way. And then I found myself in a venture fund as an EIR, where I got to work with some really great humans who are trying to, I think, not only make good investments, but then also to kind of help these founders build strong companies, which really resonated with me. And so I got to help them kind of get smart on frontier tech, and do a little bit of diligence and make some investments in that realm. While at the same point, they helped me kind of evaluate whether or not I was going to start another company of my own. It turns out I ended up starting a venture fund instead. Uh, but lo and behold, I got to kind of make some really good friends and also ended up moving from the West Coast to the East Coast and experiencing that entire kind of transition of environment and culture and network and so on and so forth.
Because you have such a mixed kind of frontier background, and like you said, it's sort of frenetic, and there's a big some kind of chaotic elements to it. It really prepared your brain to think in multi-dimensional ways, right? And at the boundary, which is really important for investments. And then you decide after, working with different companies, advising them, and working with startups, you then say, you know what, I'm going to start a fund, and it's an early stage venture fund. You're investing in frontier technology, so it kind of fits everything that you've done, and you got this idea of plausible science fiction, which it is, right? So again, it kind of reminds me of, I did a fireside with ACM with Vinod Khosla, and he's kind of always at the frontier, right? And was reading like hours every day at the Outlier and things like that. So that incentivizes different kinds of ideas. And you call it atypical. It's interesting. I had a conversation with another gentleman where he's really big on the atypical side, but it's really people who are on the spectrum, right?
Or divergence,
And
yeah.
yeah, and so and he feels there's a lot of innovation happening when you're on the spectrum, right? So I mean, why the atypical ventures is because, you know, what was the kind of the catalyst for that naming?
So the name honestly came from taking a step back and trying to think of what I myself enjoyed and appreciated. So I came from this frenetic environment of working on satellites and space and so forth, and then spent a bit of time on kind of the pure software side. And I think that at the time there was a it's funny to say this now just because how much kind of dollars and focus has gone into frontier, and it's become a little more I guess acceptable. But even going back 5, 10 years, frontier was truly, kind of the crazy space. No one wanted to do hardware, and no one wanted to do aerospace, and all of these things that I just really enjoyed. And I think that when I started to think about what I would want to name this thing and kind of the types of people and the types of companies that I would want to back, it was plausible science fiction. It was, what is just now kind of technically possible that looks crazy but will be inevitable ultimately. And so, we say literal and figurative moonshots, and we're looking for also what I'd classify as maybe a very unique founder archetype, which I think also harkens to the notion of atypical. I wouldn't say that we explicitly look for folks on the spectrum, but we do look for a very particular type of founder. We classify them as an engineer with empathy. And really what that means is we're looking for the raw intellectual horsepower to build the impossible thing, combined with enough intellectual humility to kind of inspire and select the right superpowers around you to create a transformative company. And so it's funny like to think about it now, but that archetype really came out of my experience at Spire, where I interviewed literally thousands of engineers across every major engineering university in the country, in addition to engineers coming out of, this, that, and the other company. And through that process, really honed in on this notion of you need someone who can not just do the thing, but they can actually walk out of the closet that they've been locked in and talk to other people and communicate and really look for kind of the feedback and the input from others that makes 1+1 = 4 as opposed to 1+1 = 2.
I mean, I indicated just before our interview here, I just interviewed Bob Langer, and he was so fit. What you're talking about, he's one of 9 institutional professors at MIT, which is their highest honor. He's got 1,500 patents plus. He's got over 450,000 citations, most in history. He's co-founded over 40 companies, including Moderna, and he would definitely fit. And he's empathetic. He's actually just a really nice servant leader person, right? And so very thoughtful, and he would definitely fit your thesis, except he's doesn't need investment money. His patents are actually used in or sub-licensed in over 400 companies, not to mention the 40 that he co-founded, including Moderna.
Why are you talking to me then? You should have just extended that conversation. My goodness.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, but this one is a lot of fun too, because you're built from the same cloth, because you're really looking at outliers, and you enjoy that space, and and you're really interested in looking at things that are different, and then finding the people that you can work with. In your case, you're looking for founders. In his case, just looking for
Yeah.
graduate students, right?
Yeah. No,
Who
it's
you can
true.
mentor, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, and he has the largest lab at MIT. So I mean, it's kind of, there's just so many similarities now. I realize in talking with you, and I just find these such a joy. Now you're investing in synthetic biology, and it's interesting that I had an interview with one of the foremost leaders in quantum biology. Have you ever looked at that area at all?
I have not. I've been deeply into quantum sensors recently, but I have not looked at quantum biology. I'm fascinated. Tell me more. What did you
Yeah,
pull
in
from
fact, what
this?
I can do post interview here is I could do an introduction to the lady who's one of the world leaders at Clarice at IEEE. So quantum biology is taking a look at the quantum effects that are in biology. For example, birds can migrate,
Yes.
long distances because they can sense magnetic fields and things like that. And that's probably some kind of quantum effect. The ability of plants to take sun energy and convert it, or take the sun and convert it to energy. Probably some kind of quantum effect
Yep.
is happening. So she's looking at other quantum effects, and she realizes that maybe there's some electromagnetic kind of components to this, and if you could do that, she figures she can modulate it and then use it. So
Uh,
yeah.
okay, so this is fascinating. I've been looking at electrostatics, which is a fascinating space, and the notion that if you have higher precision sensors, so like a Rydberg atom, you can ultimately sense the fluctuations of a bird's wings, which gives you then the electromagnetic or the electrostatic kind of reading of that impact. And there's a notion that plants themselves, so certain flowers that have pollen still in them versus those that have already been harvested, give off their own electrical charge, and the electrostatic kind of differential gives the birds an understanding of which plant to go after based on which one has been harvested versus which is not. And so, anyway, this is a fascinating space, and yes, I would love to learn more.
Yeah. Okay, so on synthetic biology, tell me about some of the things that you're interested in that field, because it's a burgeoning, huge field, right?
Yes. So, it's interesting. I mean, Atypical invest in plausible science fiction, as you mentioned. We I would say the only constant is change. And what I mean by that is, we don't invest in kind of one type of frontier tech. We literally invest across the ABCs, or the atoms, bits, and cells, and that entire spectrum. And I think we're always trying to evolve maybe what the thesis is, insofar as like it's a collection of theses in each individual fund that we have. And so this latest fund, really, we saw everything happening in AI, and we were kind of took a step back and said, okay, well, what are the second and third order effects, and where could kind of infinite compute have a unique advantage? And biology is kind of an obvious one. But I think the difference there is that I don't really see biology in the context of just better kind of better models to kind of model out, say, like AlphaFold or something like that. Biology is the original complex adaptive system. And so for me, it kind of comes down to, can you sit at that intersection between analog and digital? Or more appropriately in synthetic biology, can you sit at the point of experimentation? And can you actually increase the throughput of experimentation, or that flow rate of experimentation, such that you can create a data exhaust that cannot be matched by anybody else? And so the kind of investments or partnerships that we've made in synthetic biology are kind of at that intersection, where the company has come up with some novel innovation that allows them to experiment that much faster than everybody else, which also creates a data exhaust that feeds back into their own kind of compute capability and modeling that gives them a relative advantage that compounds with time. And so we made an investment into a company that's doing human immune organoids. So they're growing human immune organoids, or your immune system, in a petri dish, allowing major pharma companies to rapidly iterate through the drug development cycle by giving pharma companies human biology to test new drugs against on day one of development, as opposed to waiting for year 10 when you can actually get into human clinical trials. And so you just massively shrink the timeline for iteration speed at those pharma companies, and you shrink down the actual budget that they have to spend on every new drug development by $1 billion or more per drug, ultimately.
That's really, really fascinating. I'm just thinking, a good friend of mine now is Ali Condemusini. Do you know him at all? Or
No.
yeah, he's a student and was mentored by Bob Langer, and he's the CEO and of the Terasaki Institute for Biomedical Innovation. So they've created organs on a chip technologies, organoid technologies, and they're actually now working on a 3D printing of organs themselves, which involves CRISPR to take off the immune issues so that you can kind of scale this and mass produce it. All the science they have, and now it's just the engineering they're working on. And they're working on the liver because it's considered the most difficult. And if they could do the liver, or not yet, when they do the liver, then they could do any other organ ring. And they figure it'll take about 3 to 5 years. And so happy to do an intro if you're intrigued by that work. And
I mean, my problem is rabid curiosity, so I'm always intrigued by almost anything that you will come up with that sounds slightly crazy. I'm in.
Just... yeah, and he's such a great person too. It's kind of like a Bob Langer kind of guy, very curious. He's interested in a lot of things. He's at the frontier with everything he's done. And the Terasaki Institute, they've been spinning out these companies, right? There are a bunch of them. They've done, their faculty have done one called iOrgan Bio, which can do AI-driven robotic organ manufacturing at scale for the same reasons, for testing and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, Bob Langer, he's got a project with the students where they're using a personalized organ, so the brain, right? So, and then all the possibilities that are possible there. So anyways, and then I guess you get into Yamanaka, right? And the kind of the father of all of this, and won the Nobel Prize in 2012 with the IP to do pluripotent stem cells and all the possibilities, right? So have you met Yamanaka at all, or?
I've not. We do have one investment that uses iPSC cells focused on regrowing axons, so directed regrowth of axons with some specific applications in kind of the ocular regrowths around eye muscles, and then also in spinal cord injury.
Yeah, I Yamanaka is the, I guess, the chief scientist for this investment that supposedly Bezos and others have made over $1 billion on kind of tackling aging, but it's really, really fascinating.
See, all the cool people. I'm just hidden in the corner trying to make investments into people that are playing around the fringes.
There's a gentleman, his name is Philip Wong, and he's at Stanford, just an amazing individual. And any of the chip work that you're seeing in the States right now, in fact, globally, that's him. And a couple of years ago, I interviewed him 2 times, and I wrote a Forbes piece on it because his work is so fast. In fact, I'm trying to do other interviews, just trying to get our schedules to work. But this is 2 years ago, and he was creating chips that you can implant into cells, and you can manipulate them, right? Wirelessly, so that like behavior of the cell, you can use them for drug delivery and things like that, right? So I think that's kind of fascinating. I can do an intro if you're interested. But I guess we can kind of go down this path forever, right? I mean, it's such an interesting field of where it's going, right? So.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating to see just how rapidly it's evolving. I think it's also kind of, not to get too much on a soapbox, but I think it's a space where there should be more dollars flowing than there are. Just given bio touches in many ways everything around us at this point in time and has implications. And so if we can spend more time looking at ways to kind of manipulate biological matter in the same way that we try to manipulate bits and bytes, it becomes a very interesting kind of place to be, and we can ultimately improve the human condition demonstrably. And yet today we kind of have bifurcation where you have traditional VCs that invest primarily in pure tech and don't touch bio, and traditional bio investors who invest in druggable targets and don't touch anything that has tech kind of risk or association necessarily.
And you're looking at anything that's transformational is kind of like the next generation, right? The sort of the
Yeah, I like
outliers
that Venn diagram overlap of where you have
right.
some technical and you have some bio, and the two things can come together, and you get kind of those reciprocal benefits back from each other.
Now, another area of interest is lunar data centers. Tell me more about this. That's really at the frontier, right? So.
Yes, it definitely catches a lot of attention. It's a good cocktail party story. So we invested into a company called Lone Star that is focused on lunar data centers or data backup as a service ultimately. And so it's a fascinating one because as soon as you say data centers on the moon, it truly sounds science fiction. But then when you dig into it and you kind of peel back the layers, it's all about security. Like it is a security play. So they can provide a level of security that cannot be matched by any company on Earth, ultimately. So you can provide data sovereignty, which is a big deal for any sort of government customers, as you can imagine. So if you're the US government or you're a state government, you have to back up on kind of sovereign soil. In space, it works a little bit differently based on kind of how treaties have been laid out and so forth. But you can have two boxes next to each other. Each one can be a sovereign entity. And so you can provide sovereignty in space that you can't necessarily get here on Earth, irrespective of any geopolitical risk or climate risk, et cetera. And you can provide chain of custody. So rather than transmitting your data through someone else's internet pipes, you can ultimately have an antenna on your rooftop that talks point to point to your data center with no one in between. So you can provide those two things in addition to kind of cost advantages, both on kind of CapEx and OpEx, and speed advantages as well relative to many other kind of traditional data backup services. But it was a fascinating kind of investment for us. We made it at the point in time where the company had spectrum rights on the moon, so allowing you to kind of communicate back and forth. And it was really only two entities in the world that kind of had the same level of spectrum rights in this seed stage company and a global superpower. And so we kind of looked at this and we said, okay, this kind of makes sense. Like there's some intrinsic value in addition to the fact that this is a team of people who are highly credible, have launched things to space, and have all the kind of right resources around them to kind of make this possible.
So will you still have to go to people like the ITU and the spectrum rights, because they do allocate spectrum?
So they've already done that. So they had already gotten allocated spectrum at the point when we made the investment.
And that's really, really interesting. That's kind of really forward thinking. And of course, NIST in August of last year came out with their 3 post-quantum cryptography algorithms. And of course, you have to have this embedded now, right? The NSA is requiring it by 2027. And then there's some other deadlines by 2030. And then everybody has to have it, or you wouldn't even be allowed to communicate by 2035. So this will have to be quantum proof as well, right? So it's kind of interesting. That's a fascinating investment, and I mean I can see all the possibilities, and that's really where things are going, right? With the Artemis missions, and of course China's doing lots of stuff as well, right?
Oh yeah,
and India's growing in their capabilities, Japan and others. So, how about nuclear isotopes? Tell me about that. What is that? I mean, I know what it is, but what are the investments in this area?
So nuclear, I would say we were relatively early to the nuclear kind of investment space. We invested into a company called Atomic Alchemy, which was recently acquired by Oklo, which is a public company. Atomic Alchemy is fascinating. I had gone down this rabbit hole looking into small modular reactors and had a thesis around SMRs becoming very prevalent and the world ultimately looking for new sources of energy. Mind you, this was in 2019, so well before kind of the AI takeoff moment and everything just
Right.
went crazy. Uh, and at that point, there were a number of SMR players, and a lot of kind of opportunity, but at the same point, as I dug more and more into kind of the problem space and tried to understand what I would classify as like the layers of abstraction, I found that everything that we think and talk about with regard to nuclear essentially sits at the application layer. So you have SMRs that are providing energy, you have uh, radio pharma, which is taking isotopes and putting it into scans of hospital and so forth. You have nuclear batteries, you have fusion. All these things kind of take as fuel some base kind of isotope to drive a reaction. And the reaction is the thing that we talk about and the thing that people buy. But those base isotopes or that fuel is hyper concentrated. And so when I started to look at the nuclear fuel kind of space, I became very clear very quickly that you're essentially talking about a handful of governments around the world that control nuclear fuel for the entire world. They run government subsidized, government funded reactors. None of them are in the United States. And that's where we get it. And so it's just this hyper constrained marketplace. And it was fascinating to look and see all these applications kind of popping up with SMRs and so forth. But no one was tackling the base problem. And so it became clear that, okay, you might be able to outrun everybody else to get the fuel that you need to build the thing, but why doesn't someone solve the fuel problem to break that artificial constraint on the market? And you could probably see an entire renaissance of new applications and new opportunities that we haven't even dreamed of because we haven't thought of the fact that, oh, I can take this isotope and I can do X, Y, or Z with it that I didn't think I could do before because I couldn't even get access to the isotope to even test it to know that I could do something. And so through that process, we found this company, Atomic Alchemy. Thomas, the founder, had run the research reactor at INL previously, was incredibly versed in the space, had been on the other end of all these customers looking to get isotopes that they just could not access and could not get in quantity. And he spun out to start this company to really solve that fuel problem and that constraint. And so when we found him and we had this conversation, it was kind of I say it was a no-brainer, even though it was a very difficult thing to get through in that you're basically investing in a research project. So you're talking about investing in a company that won't have a physical thing like a reactor for multiple years, and it's going to go through full regulatory review and all this stuff. You're basically like signing up for a migraine for 2 years before you see any sort of production. But we just believe so much in Thomas and in what he was doing, and like the notion that you had to solve this problem before you could ever see that kind of nuclear renaissance, that we made the bet and like got to work really closely with Thomas over the couple of years that we were invested before Oklo stepped in, and they were part number 4, and then they ended up buying the company. But it was a fantastic ride, and I think ultimately it's also proven out. And that we've seen a number of companies kind of pop up even recently focused on this nuclear fuel problem. And we've seen even more companies pop up focused on SMRs and localization of nuclear and so on and so forth. So it's a fascinating space. And again, you can just probably feel my curiosity, like my rabid excitement coming through on this.
Yeah, and if you look at the International Energy Agency, they're predicting that data centers, right, will consume 1,000 terawatts by 2030, and that's 3% of global energy. And in the U.S., predictions of what, 6.7, 6.8% to 12% by 2028. And of course, the big solutions are things like different kinds of renewables, but also small modular nuclear reactors, right? And they got to be fueled. And so it's amazing that you were way ahead of the curve, right? And that's where you get these phenomenal returns, and you're also making a huge contribution to the landscape, right? And being a catalyst for a better future for the world. So that's an amazing, interesting story. It's I was hosted by Marisa Vecchioni, who used to run the Global Good Lab and Fund for Bill. And I toured his facility back in 2018. And it's interesting, they had a full liquid salt modular reactor there, which they had ideated at the Global Good Funded Lab. And it was just kind of fascinating back in 2018. So, I can relate to everything you're doing. It's really, really fascinating. Okay, how about critical infrastructure? What are some of the areas that are really interesting there for you?
Uh, I mean, it depends on the time. I think like right now we've looked a little bit at battery tech, certainly as most have. We have looked a little bit at even kind of software tooling and the like for, I guess, grid management and kind of demand forecasting and so forth. We've looked at sensor networks focused on kind of monitoring critical infrastructure, so bridges and buildings and so on and so forth. I find that there's probably unique opportunities right now around water and kind of, there's ocean opportunities certainly, and I think kind of global transit and trade and kind of moving of goods is one thing. But I also think about like freshwater. And so we've done some looks, I guess, into the market around kind of water filtration and kind of treatment plants. Um, it's kind of it's a little bit hard, I guess, like to pick out one because it really depends on the point in time. I'd say, American dynamism is an interesting place to talk about just because uh, defense was always, when I think back 5 or 10 years, it was really, when you talk about hard tech, you talk about things that are dual use, just inherently hard tech and dual use went together. And that meant kind of defense tech. And I think it's been interesting to see the bifurcation. And now you have kind of hard tech and you have defense tech. But I would say defense tech and like that space kind of falls into kind of critical infrastructure as you think about it. And so we've certainly seen some things there. Data centers on the moon, I would consider critical infrastructure insofar as you're talking about data backup for humanity's most important data. But then at the same point, you could talk about kind of waste recycling. And so we invested into a company that's using computer vision and robotics to handle kind of the waste stream. And in that case, it's a fascinating one because, we recycle, a fraction of the entire waste stream. I think it's single digit percentages. Something around like 6-7% of the waste stream actually gets recycled just because it's not economically feasible to recycle the rest. But if you can cut down through the use of, both fast picking using robotics and computer vision to actually do the sorting through that system, you could probably start to increase that and flip that. So you actually start to recycle closer to 93% of the waste stream as opposed to the 7. And then you start to move all of those kind of newly sorted goods back into the overall economy. And I think that becomes quite interesting. So depending on who you ask, like that could be critical infrastructure as well.
Have you, have you ever toured there's this international science and engineering competition, and it's like all of these different countries, and it's for juniors, and I judged it a few years representing ACM and things like that because we give out like an award. And so it used to be sponsored by Intel. I don't know who sponsors it right now. Have you ever toured that and taken a look at it? It's all out there. It's all amazing.
But I would love to do that because it also strikes me, random aside, but was going on tours of schools here in New York and they have small kids. And at one of these schools we passed through, there was an entire kind of science wing to the school. And they were talking about how the students in high school could start to pick their own curriculum and they could design their own science curriculum. And the number of things that were just completely out there that were fascinating from these high school students effectively was just unreal. And I think like the more that we can kind of start to like cultivate and like spark that curiosity that much more, the better. But all that to say, like I would love to tour this. Where is it? When is it? Like tell me more.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done it for years, but it's the International Science and Engineering Fair. It's just a great event. You can sign up for to be a judge and to offer a prize of some sort, and which I did under Reds Capital, but I also did with the ACM, and it was just so much fun. And
Oh yeah.
the innovation, I mean, one of the students we gave a prize to, he was like a high schooler. He had invented a parallel mechanism for CPUs, and it was better than what Intel had. I mean, really, so this kind of microcode stuff, and it was just amazing, right? And um, just it's just phenomenal, kind of out of the box thinking. It would definitely fit
Oh
the
yeah.
things you do, and you
Yeah.
catch these people early, right? So,
Yes. When you have no preconceived notion of how it has to be, it's
yeah,
amazing
yeah,
the things you can
exactly.
accomplish.
Yeah. So that's a lot of fun. I should do that again. That was kind of amazing.
Well, when you do
We're
it, please invite me. I will come. I will join you.
yeah, maybe we could do it together, right?
Yeah.
And then offer a joint prize or something like that, and you go on
We
stage
could put
and
somebody's
offer this.
project up in, the data center on the moon. Like, yeah, yeah, we can figure this out.
Yeah, yeah, it'll be a lot of fun. But I'm just really everything you're doing is just so exciting, and I can see how you're making such a difference to the world. We're down to the last few questions here, and I realize I can spend days with you now. I mean, we can start sharing some of the things we both are doing. Um, have you actually connected with IEEE entrepreneurship by any chance at all, or
I've not.
so IEEE? You're familiar with IEEE?
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, reading a research paper on IEEE, it led me to one of our core investments, our first fund.
Yeah,
Very
in fact,
familiar.
yeah, yeah. And in fact, we have an entrepreneurship program where we connect startups with investors. We have global summits. I mean, keynoting some of those, and of course, bringing investors and startups to that. So that'll be something I think you'll find really, really interesting, because if you look at John Hennessy back in the 70s and 80s when he did the risk architecture,
Yeah,
co-created that stuff. I mean, that's now risk 5, right?
yeah,
And it's, Jensen Wong comes from these communities as well, because, they publish your papers are presenting at the big conference at IEEE, but also ACM under SIGRAM. So what these ACM and IEEE or what we're doing now is we're trying to take all of that translational research that's out there, and we are the two biggest communities in the world, and trying to help them when people have an idea and they want to commercialize it. It used to be the John Hennessy's of the world, who's now chair of Alphabet. They had no help. They had to do it all on their
yeah.
own. And now we're trying to figure out ways to help them. So I think you'll find that really, really interesting. Anyways, are there any communities that you want to kind of surface that you recommend that people should engage in, or events that you want to engage in, or maybe ones that you're involved with?
Um, I think I'll. So, I will call this out here because I think that you and your community and your audience are maybe well positioned for it. But one of the things that I have been thinking about for a long time and would love to see exist in the world is I basically want to see the null space around kind of research today. And so if you think about peer reviewed kind of journals and so forth, I want to know the things that are coming from credible individuals, but are slightly outside of the norm and maybe not accepted by kind of the masses. And so the, papers that are rejected by the journal, but ultimately maybe presented at a conference. And so trying to identify kind of those things that fall slightly outside of, I guess, accepted um, spaces because I think that's where now we have a lot of the tools to actually test and iterate on those much faster. And so it's not that it's actually too crazy and it doesn't deserve to have the time and attention, but instead, I think it's now a place where we should bring those together and we should actually have kind of the capability to see these things such that, maybe a researcher can get funding from the private sector or otherwise to kind of help them along the path, and or connect with folks like myself who like the things that sound crazy today but are inevitable tomorrow. And so, I'll pose that I think that there's a space for uh, the things that fall outside of peer review.
That's really, really fascinating. So, excuse me, let's see if I can do something because I'm in different parts of leadership within IEEE and ACM and IFIP. And, IEEE is the #1 tech organization in the world, really old. And ACM, we're the largest, oldest computer science organization. I've been on board committees and chairing since 2009. And you know what? Let's see if I can poke around internally and we could do something here. And the reason I mentioned this, I interviewed Jeff Hinton earlier this year and Jan LeCun, and there's the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CFAR. They funded here in Canada Jeff Hinton's work for decades, right? And it's because it was an outlier. And in fact, when I interviewed Jan LeCun and Jeff Hinton, they said they would kind of they couldn't even get published, right? Because deep learning was considered an outlier. Nobody wanted to see it. And when I talked to Jeff at the University of Toronto, and of course he won the Nobel Prize last year, right? And the ACM Turing Award, and he said, I talked to, or their team talked to Ilias Eskimo was part of his team, and Alex, and then he had AlexNet, and then that kind of miracle thing they did at ImageNet. But in the lead up to that, they realized GPUs could work. They reached out to Jensen Huang and said, "Can we get a GPU?" And he just didn't respond. But after ImageNet, and they had that big leap, he was more than happy to provide with GPUs, right? So it is because it was considered an outlier, right?
Yeah.
So
well,
that's what
even
you're
he
looking
has
for,
said
right?
multiple times that it was a hacked GPU that basically gave them the capability. So it wasn't even necessarily like it was made for this purpose, but they made it work. And it was only after the fact that, they realized, okay, this could be scaled and can work in many other areas. So, I think the power of outliers and the power of folks who can kind of hack together those systems is incredibly powerful. And frankly, the entire reason that we created Atypical was to kind of identify those wild, spiky outliers and to give them some of the tools and resources, including, as you mentioned earlier, kind of narrative help and the ability to sell, and give them some capital and see if we can bring these things forth into the world. It's kind of like, if you believe that it can actually improve the world, like it's a moral imperative that we improve their marketing and their ability to tell the story such that they can actually scale it and get it into the world.
Yeah, and these things are really a lot of fun. I mean, just like Bob Langer was for many years was an outlier. He had trouble getting hired as an engineer, right? Because he was an outlier. I mean, his thinking was so advanced and so phenomenal that people, or if you look at the two researchers who, said that there was a bacterial kind of basis to a lot of ulcers, and they were kind of rejected and ridiculed for a long time. And then, and of course, they won the Nobel Prize, right? So for that work. You know what? Let's continue this conversation. But I was going to, I indicated I need to set up for my next interview. But I have one kind of two-part question, and that is, what kind of recommendations you want to leave the audience? And then the second part is, what questions do you want to leave the audience? So first of all, what recommendations would you like to leave the audience?
I guess my recommendation would be to step outside of the ephemeral. It's so easy to get caught in either news cycles or social media or otherwise, and all that stuff is ephemeral. It disappears as soon as it's kind of put up. And I think to step away and read things that are much more evergreen in content and consume things that are much more evergreen. Certainly how I spend my time, and I think it allows me maybe a little more time to reflect and kind of project forward what the future may look like, as opposed to getting caught in kind of the here and now. So that would be my recommendation. Read more, lots of books.
Yeah, and it's almost like Bernard saying that he's reading every day on the Outlier, right? And you got to separate the noise, and then put some really phenomenal stuff on the Outlier, right? And in the ACM, we actually produce a daily news brief. It's called Tech News, where we look at the things that are at the edge. And of course, you see in the IEEE spectrum, there's daily news feeds. And in fact, I've got a keynote coming up at WHX Tech next week in Dubai. It's kind of like the largest healthcare conference. And I actually surveyed 5,000 innovations from this year from IEEE and ACM, and then I produced a report where I'm keynoting, where I'm going to offer to the audience, where I selected 100 that are at the edge, but have veracity. I mean, they're valid, right? So, but they're at the edge. So I can really kind of relate to that. Now, what questions do you want to leave the audience? So, what are more questions?
Oh, if you could suspend others' disbelief, what do you think will be true in the near future? Because I think, and what I mean by that is we spend so much time trying to kind of convince others. I think we as humans try to convince others, and that sometimes precludes us from kind of taking the step forward that we may need to take. And so I would pose to people kind of the question of, if you were to step outside of the bounds of trying to convince other people of the thing that you believe, like, sit with that thing that you believe and try to assess whether or not you could actually make it reality. That would be maybe the question. And I think that gets back to this notion of, like, I truly believe in curiosity, and that curiosity is a superpower. And if you can dive into your curiosity and go down some rabbit holes, you can find some really kind of magical things. And I think this, flip side of that, or kind of the compliment, is meeting good people is its own reward. And so the more that you kind of spend time, trying to meet people that you truly find fascinating, even through cold outreach, I think that there's a superpower in that, because you can kind of increase your surface area for luck, which itself is, something kind of magical. So I've, gotten jobs, and I've gotten investors, and I've gotten investments, all from the power of just like being willing to kind of reach out cold to someone and say, hey, I think what you're doing is fascinating. Can we talk?
Yeah, and there's a lot to sort of communication. This idea of running experiments, kind of thinking at the boundary, networking with people who are diverse. In fact, there's a research that suggests that you get more innovation if your community is very diverse. And you do this combinatorial thinking. So you're always kind of trying to connect the dots between different ideas. And they don't have to be tech. It could be musicians with artists, with, psychologists, government. It doesn't matter, right? Just try to fit all the pieces. Chris, I really enjoyed this, dialogue with you and sharing with you, just like I did with Bob Langer earlier. And I got another one coming up. Thank you for sharing all this deep insights with me. You got just an amazing history of accomplishment, contribution, innovation, and just so remarkable. And you're doing so much good for the world. So thank you again.
No, Stephen, thank you. This was an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate you and all you put into this. It was great.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.